We argue that what's driving this norm erosion is partisan polarization. Certainly rising economic inequality, changing media structures, all of these things matter and exacerbate the problem. But we emphasize that fueling all of this is the fact that Republicans and Democrats have grown so far apart that they literally fear and loathe each other. In 1960, 4 or 5% of Republicans said in surveys that they would be displeased if their child married a Democrat. Today, that number is 50% for both parties. Last year, our Pew survey found 49% of Republicans and 55% of Democrats said that the other party makes them afraid. We've not seen this level of partisan polarization and hatred since the 19th century. And it's not just traditional left-right polarization. People do not fear and loathe each other over taxes and healthcare. They just don't. Partisan differences run much deeper. They're about race, religion, and way of life. So our parties have changed dramatically over the last 50 years. If you go back to the 1960s and 70s, when many of us were growing up, the two parties were demographically and culturally very similar. Both parties were overwhelmingly white, equally religious approximately. The parties differed on taxes and government spending and foreign policy, but on race and religion, they were similar and overlapping. 3 changes have occurred over the last half-century. First, the achievements of the civil rights movement in the 1960s led to a massive migration of Southern whites from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. The enfranchisement of African Americans in the South also led to the migration of African Americans to the Democratic Party. Second, the U.S. experienced a massive wave of immigration, mostly from Latin America and from Asia, and most of these immigrants ended up in the Democratic Party. And then the third big transformation under Reagan, evangelical Christians, conservative Christians, had been evenly split between Democrats and Republicans, flocked to the Republican Party. So by the 2000s, then, the Democrats and Republicans were now demographically very different. The Democrats were mostly a rainbow coalition of urban educated whites and a range of ethnic minorities. Republicans, by contrast, remained overwhelmingly white and Christian. And this is important because white Christians are not just any group. They were once the majority electorally, and they used to sit unchallenged atop political, economic, social, and cultural hierarchies in the United States. They built the presidency, the Congress, the Supreme Court, governor's mansions, and they were pillars of local communities. They were the CEOs, the newscasters, the sports stars, the professors. And crucially, these were the faces of both the Democratic and Republican Party. Those days are long over. But losing a majority status and losing one's social status can be deeply, deeply threatening. Many Republican voters, of course not all, but many feel like the country they grew up in is being taken away from them. This is what we think ultimately, we make the case in the book, that we think is driving the polarization. Now, polarization is dangerous because extreme polarization can kill democracies. This is a major lesson from the failure of democracy in Europe in the 1930s and Latin America in the 1960s and 70s. When politics is so deeply polarized that each side views the victory of the other as intolerable, as beyond the pale, democracy is really in trouble. When an opposition views, when a government views, or when each side views the other as intolerable, we start to justify using extraordinary measures to defeat the other side. Things like violence, election fraud, and coups. Of course, in the United States, we've not reached that point, but we have reached a point where, according to exit polls in the 2016 presidential election, 1 in 4 Trump voters believed he was unfit for office, yet they still preferred him over the Democratic candidate. So we've reached a point where, according to recent polls, Republicans have a more favorable view of Vladimir Putin than Hillary Clinton. This is a dangerous level of polarization. So Trump is a challenge, but the most fundamental challenge is this extreme polarization. Driven by a radicalized Republican Party that represents a declining white Christian majority whose members perceive themselves as facing an existential threat. Trump is certainly a symptom of that problem, but he did not cause it. His departure from office won't